Daphna did her PhD in psychobiology at the University of Tel Aviv, focusing on how connections in the brain are organized. After, she received an Allen Fellowship to join the Faculty of Neuroscience, and today she's a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Tel-Aviv University, and her research focused on the relations between sex, gender, brain structure, and function. She uses a wide range of methods to analyze diverse data sets, from large collections of brain scans to information obtained with self-report questionnaires. And in today's talk, Daphna will describe data from animal and human studies that challenge the binary sex framework and present our hypothesis, the mosaic brain, that claim that sex differences in the brain do not add up consistently in individuals. She will explain all the details in her talk. Let's give a warm round of applause for Daphna, please.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and for organizing this. And thank you, Bassem and Dana, because you've done a great job. It's almost unnecessary to give this one, but I will anyway. So before we can rethink about sex, brain, and gender beyond the binary, I want to start with the binary framework. And within the binary framework, the taken for granted starting point is that there are male and female brains. And then the research question is always, are there sex differences? So we compare males and females and look for sex differences. And when these are found, the conclusion is that there are male and female brains. And you can see this self-maintaining belief system in the comments of an anonymous reviewer who wrote, "The usefulness of the dichotomization into male and female brains stems not only from its biological reality." Let's stop here. So for this researcher, the question of the male and female brain is not a scientific hypothesis that needs to be tested, but a biological reality, a taken for granted starting point. And the reviewer continues. So the usefulness of the dichotomization stems from the fact that sex differences exist in brain structure and function. And the collective evidence, that is the existence of these differences, still overwhelmingly warrants categorization of brains as belonging to different, if often overlapping, populations, that is, as female and male brains. So the reviewer starts from asserting that there are male and female brains and concludes that indeed there are male and female brains without ever considering any other possible type of relations between sex and the brain. And we can see this, again, self-maintaining belief system in a very famous summary diagram of the study of the human connectome. In this study, the researchers assessed the strengths of over 9,000 connections and found differences in several dozens. It will not surprise you that the title of the paper was not "The brains of men and women are extremely similar." They focused on the differences. But let's go with them and focus on the differences. This summary diagram depicts all the connections that were stronger on men compared to women in the upper panel, and all the connections that were stronger in women compared to men in the lower panel. The color code is blue for intrahemispheric connections and orange for interhemispheric connections. And the diagram, as well as the accompanying text, clearly reveals the researcher's assumption that the upper panel represents the typical male brain and the lower panel represents the typical female brain, and that what is typical of the brains of males is to have male typical features or connections, and what's typical of the brains of females is to have female typical connections. Now, at first, this sounds completely logical. This is a logic we are very familiar with from the genitalia. In the genitalia, this is indeed the case. What is typical of males is to have only male typical genital organs, and what's typical of females is to have only female typical genital organs. The reason to suspect that the logic of the genitalia does not apply to the brain is that there is lots of evidence from animal studies that in the brain, what is typical of males and females may be different and even opposite under different conditions. And because this is such a huge difference between the relations between sex and genitalia and sex and the brain, I will illustrate it looking at a single study. In this study, the researchers looked at the density of dendritic spines in the rat brain. So what you can see here, no you don't, So you can see here a dendrite, and we heard about them in Bassem talk, and the small extensions are the dendritic spines, and you can clearly see the sex difference, higher density of spines in females compared to males. There was another group of rats in this study, and these rats underwent 30 minutes of stress one day before their brains were assessed. And again, we see a sex difference, but it is reversed. What we thought was typical of males, low spine density, is typical of females after stress. And what was typical of females is now typical of males. Now, you don't look astonished enough. So imagine what you would feel or think if I told you that 30 minutes of stress were enough to change your clitoris into a penis or your penis into a clitoris. Okay, now you're getting it. Now, we are laughing because this never happens with genitalia, but it often happens in the brain. And there are many studies reporting such reversals of sex differences in many regions of the brain, in many features of the brain, and following many different manipulations. Even simply housing rats, one to a cage or several to a cage, is enough to reverse some sex differences in their cortex. And when we look at all of these studies together, as I have done, what you realize is that these interactions between sex and other factors like stress or housing conditions may be different for different brain measures. So the same manipulation, like stress, that reverses a sex difference in one brain measure may actually abolish or create a sex difference in another. So what can we learn from all of these studies? The first thing is that there are sex differences in the brain of rats and also of humans. I'll show you a few later. This means that sex-related variables affect brain structure. And indeed, there are other types of studies manipulating directly sex-related variables like hormones and genes, showing that indeed, especially hormones, affect brain structure and function. But these studies show us something in addition to this. They show that the effects of sex-related variables on the brain interact with many other factors, so that what is typical of males and females may be different and even opposite under different conditions. And this challenges the sex binary, and specifically the assumption that what is typical of males is to have only male typical features, and what's typical of females is to have only female typical features. Because even if at some specific point, let's say now, my entire brain is in the female typical form, then following some kind of an event, some of my brain features will change their form, others will not, and I will end up with a mosaic brain. Mosaic combination in terms of having both female typical and male typical features. And obviously, each brain a unique mosaic depending on the specific experiences throughout life. So this is the mosaic hypothesis I formulated over a decade ago, and a few years later, I found a way to study this or test this hypothesis in the human brain. Together with Professor Yaniv Asaf from Tel-Aviv University and a group of students, we analyzed the structure of over 1,400 human brains. And we looked at everything that you can derive from MRI images. I'm going to show you only one analysis. In this one, we divided each brain into 116 regions of gray matter, measured the volume of each region in each brain, and wrote it down in a table. In this table, each line represents a single brain, the 116 volumes. Then we used a color code to appreciate similarities and differences between the brains of men and women. We painted the region green if this region in this brain was relatively large compared to the volume of this region in all other brains, men and women combined. And we painted it yellow if it was relatively small. This is what we saw when we finished. So you see brains of men on the left, brains of women on the right. Each line, a single brain. Now, you don't need statistics to see that there are differences between the brains of men and women. At the group level, there is more green at the women's side and more yellow at the men's side. But brains are rarely all green or all yellow. Instead, each line is a unique combination, no two lines are the same, of green, which is more common in women, and yellow, which is more common in men. So again, for me, the question is not whether there are sex-gender differences in the human brain. There are, you can see them here, and others have reported similar differences. I'm also not interested in the source of these differences, nature or nurture, but only in whether they add up consistently within each brain to create two types of brains, male and female, as is almost always the case in the genitalia, and as it is almost assumed to be the case in the brain, or whether they mix up to create individual mosaics. And I think that when you look at these images, the answer is clear. Brains do not belong to two types. In fact, when I look at these images, and this goes directly to what you just said, it looks to me that we all belong into a single, highly heterogeneous population of human brains, in which what is typical of both men and women is to have a unique mosaic of male typical and female typical features. And in another set of experiments, using different analytical methods that I don't have time to go into, we tried to answer the question. So if brains do not belong to two types or to two populations, how best to think of the relations between sex and the brain? And what we concluded from these studies, and again, this is published and you can look it up, we found that the brain architectures that are typical of men are also typical of women and vice versa, and that sex category provides very little information on brain structure. Now, I want to stay, for example, for a minute with this image because I think it's very important. As I told you, there are sex differences in the brain and sex-related variables affect the brain. Usually, when we hear this, we immediately continue to conclude that this must mean that there are male and female brains. And this is because we are acting within the binary framework. But this is not true. The binary framework is not appropriate because how these sex-related variables affect the brain interact with other variables. And a better way to think about this is within the mosaic framework. And this image is very helpful because at the same time, you can see the differences, the group level differences between men and women, but you can also see that brains do not come in two types. And you can also appreciate that even though sex-related factors affect your brain, as we are here, sitting here, knowing your sex category, so knowing whether you are male or female, doesn't allow me or you to predict your brain structure. And we were able to show doesn't allow you to predict whether or how my brain would be similar or different from yours. And this general principle for the entire human brain, we can also appreciate when we look at the image we started with. So you can appreciate here that there are sex differences in the density of spines, and clearly sex-related variables affect this feature of the brain. But knowing the sex category of a rat, whether it is male or female, doesn't allow you to predict whether it will have high or low spine density. So this is this principle in the level of single features we were able to show on the level of the whole brain, human brain. And just to end up this part about the brain, I want to show you another study, not from my lab, on the human brain function using functional imaging. And they looked at what happens in the brain when people watch sexually arousing stimuli. And they found differences between the brains of men and women. Now, usually the study will end here, and we will have a big title stating how men and women, their brain react differently to sexually arousing stimuli, and probably we will have some evolutionary explanation to this. But these researchers went one step further, and they compared how much variability is explained by sex category to many other variables. And you can see that not only sex category explains the least amount of variability in the data, but it actually explains very little variability. Even machine power, whether they use 1.5 Tesla or 3 Tesla MRI machine, explained more variability in the brain's response to sexually arousing stimuli than sex category. So I hope now you get a better sense of what I think all of us were talking about. And from the brain, I want to move to gender. And when we think of gender, we know that there are many differences between females and males in cognition, personality, behavior, interests. Some are very small differences, some are larger differences. Again, I'm not interested in the source of these differences, nature or nurture, but only in whether they add up to create two types of humans, women and men. And What we did is a quite similar approach to what I showed you before. So we looked at the behaviors, attitudes, preferences, etc. of thousands of people. And within each data set, we chose the variables showing the largest gender differences. And for these, we used a blue, pink color code for masculine and feminine. So just an example, in this sample, if someone was really worried about their weight, we will color this with pink, because in this sample, as quite often the case, women were more worried about their weight on average than men. And when we were done here, this is what we saw, men on the left, women on the right. Each line here is a single individual, only 7 variables this time. And what you can easily see, again, is the group level differences. More blue at the men's side, more pink at the women's side. Now, this has to be this case. This is how we define what's masculine and what's feminine. What you can also see is that there is quite a lot of pink in the blue and quite a lot of blue in the pink. And this is because for any known psychological variable, there is some overlap between men and women. So some men would be feminine and some women would be masculine in this specific characteristic. But what we were interested in is whether there are blue and pink individuals. And there was no pink or blue individual in this data set. There were a few in another data set. Most individuals had both feminine and masculine characteristics. Now, I'm sure you know this about yourself, so every person here can name a few of their masculine or feminine characteristics. But what I can add to this is that everyone is like this. And we've recently launched a website in which everyone can answer a short questionnaire with questions about variables that usually show large sex-gender differences, and then receive their own gender mosaic, how masculine or feminine they are on this set of questions. And this is my mosaic, when my answers were compared to an American sample. So you can see that on some traits I'm masculine in blue, in some feminine in pink or red, and in some gender neutral in yellow. And obviously, what's feminine and what's masculine changes across cultures. So you can then change the comparison group and see how your mosaic changes. So this is my mosaic, so the same answers, I don't re-answer the questionnaire, the same answers, but now they are compared to a sample from Japan or from Israel. So you can play with this. And obviously, I'm not the only person that is a mosaic. Everyone is mosaic, everyone a unique mosaic. And it is an interesting question to ask. So if everyone is mosaic, why, when we look at people, we don't see the individual mosaic of each person, but rather perceive individuals as belonging to 2 types? So you look around and you see men and women. You don't see individual mosaics. And it's a good question, and we've written about this, so you can read more about this. But just in a nutshell, what I can say is that we see people as if they belong to 2 types, because the gender binary is a central part of human culture. And because of the gender binary, we label people by their gender or by their sex. We label things and activities according to gender. This creates a lot of biases, which lead us to perceive people as if they belong to 2 categories. It leads us to have essential beliefs about men and women or males and females. And we started with a sex binary and how it leads us in a circular manner to believe that there are male and female brains, and then to find always evidence for the existence of male and female brains. And we can see the same here at the cultural level. So the existence of the gender binary at the cultural level similarly reinforces the idea that indeed we belong to 2 groups, men and women, when in fact, when we look with scientific tools, we see that this is not the case. So I will end here, and thank you very much for listening.